All right. I am so excited to be here to share what our team has been working hard on over the past year to simplify the authentication experience. I'm a product manager on .NET Web Backends, and I'm here with Stefan.
Hi, yep, and I'm an engineer on ASP.NET who's recently been working on Blazor and Auth.
Awesome. So I'm going to jump right in and talk about what we've done here. So this is not the only reason we decided to look at auth, but it's a very visible issue. It's by far the most upvoted issue in our repo. And the question is about better options for authentication. Now, authentication has a lot of different flavors, and so we weren't able to tackle every single permutation. But I do want to talk about the two obvious things that we discussed. One is the idea of a full OAuth 2 OIDC server. I know that's a big request, and the team looked at this, and it's such a large undertaking, and there's so many options that are already out there. We've got paid solutions like our own Microsoft Intra or the Duende solution with Identity Server, and there's also free and open source solutions for this like Keycloak and OpenEdict. And so what we decided to do was focus on these projects that use the ASP.NET Core identity that's built in. It's a large set of projects, and it really is for dealing with that scenario when a developer has a single app that maybe has a mobile or a desktop client and doesn't want the overhead or complexity of configuring the server. So we proposed this, we got some feedback on it, and what we created was this set of identity APIs. And these APIs are designed out of the box with data transfer objects to make it straightforward for you to build those identity pieces in your single page applications and Blazor WebAssembly applications that require a user to register and log in and perform those basic identity tasks. Now, the full identity system is still there and available on the server side. These are a new set of APIs that we expose for consumption by clients. And I just want to point out, and we'll see this in the examples, that these also provide things like validation feedback with problem details in the responses so you can programmatically parse what's going on and display that result. So what I want to do is just jump right into some code and show you what it looks like with these APIs to secure a web API endpoint. And then I'm also going to look at consuming it from an Angular and a Blazor WebAssembly client, and then I'll turn it over to Stefan. So let's pop over to Visual Studio. And so what I've done here is I've just created a basic a basic ASP.NET Core Web API. This has that default weather forecast example that's built into it. And I'm going to open up the project file to show you two packages I'm going to add. Identity is actually built into ASP.NET Core, but if I want to opt into the features I'm going to show you where we're using Entity Framework Core to maintain all the data for the users, we're going to add two packages. And one of those is the Identity Entity Framework Core. That's sort of the glue that marries the two pieces together. And then the other is the implementation of Entity Framework Core. What database do you want to use? SQL Server, SQLite, another relational database. So you have to choose that provider. Because I want to limit the amount of time I spend on this, I'm using the in-memory provider, which is there for demos. It's not there for production use. But we're going to open up the program.cs, and this is the default code that is generated. And we're going to go down to the bottom, and I'm just going to add what's called a DB context. And this just tells Entity Framework Core what we expect from the database that it's going to model and interface for us. And I'm inheriting from a built-in identity database. Now you can customize the identity user and you can customize the database. So we give you these hooks, but I'm just going to plug into the default out of the box and override the constructor so that I can configure some options for that. So let's take that class, and now we're going to pop up to the top, and I'm really going to add just three little sections here. So the first one tells me that I want to use authorization. The second one configures that DB context that I just set up. And the third one is actually activating the identity API endpoints. So we're basically opting into exposing those endpoints. And it also does a lot behind the scenes for configuring support for both tokens and cookies. And we'll see that in a second. Now, if I pop back to the bottom, there's just two more things I'm going to do in this simple application. I'm going to require authorization on that endpoint so that we've secured that API. And I'm also going to expose those endpoints. So we activated them earlier, but we need to route them, and MapIdentityApi actually maps them so that they're available. So now if I hit F5 and build, and I'm going to spare you waiting for the build to go through, we pop up on our Swagger UI screen. Now, because I'm in development mode and debugging the application, it's showing me this UI that has introspected my APIs and given me definitions. So I can expand the weather forecast definition, for example, and see exactly what's expected from this API, both input and output. And then I've got this lovely try it out button that I can click, and that gives me this execute. So if I had parameters, I would set my parameters. In this case, I'm just going to click execute. And because I secured that endpoint, what I'm getting is this 401 response that's telling me I'm not authorized to the endpoint. So how do we, as a client application, get that authentication set up? First thing I'm going to do is go over to the register endpoint. Now, this endpoint defines really just two parameters, right? The email and the password of the user. So what I can do is click that try it out button and put in my super complex password right here and click execute. And what it's going to do is come back and give me a list of validation issues. And this can change. It's completely configurable based on the password policy that you follow. So I'm going to come back and give it a better password, which has non-alpha digits and capital letters and everything else. And this time I get a 200 OK. So I'm registered in the system. So I should be able to log in. We'll walk over to the login piece, and you'll notice that we've got a couple query string parameters that we can pass, as well as a schema for what we're going to send in the body. I'm not going to cover two-factor, so I'm going to ignore those parameters. And I'm also not going to talk about session cookies right now. The important thing for me is that I set use cookies to true. That's our default experience. That's the most secure way to use this built-in identity system. And then I'm going to put my email and password in the body just the same way I registered them. So I click execute, and I get that nice 200 response code. And because I'm using cookies, there shouldn't be any other work for me to pop back over to our weather forecast API. And I'm going to go ahead and open up my network settings so you can see what happens on the wire. And when I click submit, I actually get a response body this time, which is great. I get that nice 200 code and I get results back. So it's recognized I'm authenticated. And if we look over at the network side, you can see it's sent a cookie inside of that request. Now, let's say that you have a client that, for whatever reason, can't support cookies. We do provide a proprietary token that basically I just say use cookies equals false, or I don't even set that parameter. And by default, we'll generate a set of tokens. And there's an access token that you can use for authentication, and there's a refresh token that will allow you to extend the session without forcing the user to log in again. And if we look at the way those are used, this is the new HTTP format that you can run web requests from within your browser. And you'll notice that I simply set that header and pass the token in the header to make that pass. Now, let's say I have an Angular client. How would I consume this in the client? Here's a simple client. This is in our samples, by the way, so you're able to view the source code for this today. And when I click on that weather forecast, I've set it to redirect to sign in. So let's zoom in and actually register so that we can access this application. I'm going to give it a bad password at first so you can see my Angular client has parsed the validation errors and displayed them. They came from the server. Now I'm going to log in successfully. And finally, I get my weather forecast and notice that my sign in button has changed to a sign out button, and then I can log out. So if we look at the code real briefly, I know not everyone's an Angular developer, but I've built an authentication service that the Angular app can use. And if we look at the login piece, The key here is that I'm using the cookies, and if I have a successful login or not, I raise an event to notify the rest of the application that my authentication status has changed, so it knows if I've signed in or signed out. Now, because of that and the things that rely on that service, I can create something called an auth guard, which in Angular basically establishes whether a route can be navigated to or not. And so in this case, I'm not only saying that you have to be signed in if you're using the auth guard, but I'm redirecting you to the sign in page if you're not. And using that auth guard is as simple as just adding this can activate property on your route definition. And then finally, when we get the weather forecast, we have to do one small thing in the Angular application, and that's make sure that it sends their credentials because it doesn't do it by default. Now, you can use something called an interceptor to override this and make that the default behavior for everything. So in our Blazor WebAssembly has a built-in set of components that work with authentication, regardless of the type of authentication you're using. So to use the new identity APIs, I basically just customized something called the authentication state provider. You'll see that in my login, it looks a lot like the Angular service. I'm basically on success raising an event to note that it changed. And then in that request that asks for my authentication state, I'm calling an endpoint that's authorized. So if I'm not logged in, this is going to fail. If I am logged in, I can build a set of claims based on the user's identity and authenticate them. This is all activated throughout the app using this cascading authentication state that I wrap in the app.razor. And then I have this authorized route view. And this just makes the authentication work so that when the events fire, all of your components update. And then you can do the simple, I'm going to protect this with authorized. So if they're not signed in, they can't access it. And you can also use a view that allows you to specify a different fragment of UI based on whether they're authorized or not authorized. So that's a more flexible way if you don't want to block access to that entire component. And then here's the sample app. If I log in with I'm trying to register with a bad password, you can see that's also parsing the results. And then there I am completely logged in. Now that was just a very simple example of what's possible, but we've done a lot with the Blazor with the Blazor web app template. And Stefan is going to walk you through all the new changes with a brand new Blazor identity UI that we have. And I'm going to turn it over to Stefan.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. That was a great demo. From the past, I've been working on things like Cache on Signaler, and I got to work a lot on this Map Identity API. And I've been thrilled to see the feedback. People like being able to submit JSON requests and not have to deal with anti-forgery and tokens and stuff. And I like how you called it a proprietary token. That sounds fancy. But I like to call it opaque. It's encrypted. You can't read it on the client, but you can do what Jeremy did and then use the with credentials to make sure the cookie gets to the server and the server can tell you whatever you want. And after I worked on Map Identity API, like Jeremy said, I worked on the formerly known as Blazor United template to add auth to it. So if we want to look at this, we got just released update to Visual Studio 2022 with all the .NET 8 goodness, and we're going to do the Blazor web app template, which I'm sure you saw a lot of yesterday. If not, please go back and watch it. And there's some great demos. So while this is an authentication simplified talk, I'm going to make this as complicated as possible by choosing the auto interactive mode. So this means that we have WebAssembly rendering, server interactive rendering with a circuit, and server pre-rendering. And all of these need to be able to get this authentication state that Jeremy was talking about earlier. So the question is, what's the best way to do that? So I'm going to, like a cooking show, take this pre-baked template out of the oven, and I will show you what we have going on. So I made a few edits to this that I commented out just to show you how you can modify this template, but otherwise it's pretty basic. And compared to the normal non-authentication template, the biggest thing you're going to notice is that you have this account folder. And this defines all of the identity-related Razor components, like login, register, allows you to manage your account, change email, things of that nature. But to support this, we did a bunch of things. So we added cascading authentication state. This is just another way to do what Jeremy showed you earlier with a tag. We can also put this in our program CS. Since we chose the auto interactivity mode, we have both a server and client project. If you watched Steve's demo yesterday, you will have learned that the client components, like this auth required component, can run on the server during pre-rendering and also rendered interactivity via WebAssembly or server interactivity. So maybe this should have been called a .everywhere assembly or a .everywhere project, but it's really important to know this. Just because this is in the client project doesn't mean this a component is solely rendered via WebAssembly. So this leads to the question of what's the best way to authenticate this? Historically, with SPA applications, you only have to authenticate on the client side and because you don't have to pre-render sensitive data. But if you do want to be able to pre-render data that only an authenticated user can see, you basically are forced to use cookies, right? Because that's the only credential a browser is going to send normally. I mean, there are like cert flows and so forth, but we're not going to focus on that. So that's exactly what we'll do. A lot of things are going to seem familiar with this template compared to what you just saw with that MapIdentityApi sample. This is individual auth. So it's using ASP.NET Core identity. We're registering our DB context, which gives us our EF identity stores. And we have this application user, which you can then add custom properties to. And then furthermore, by default, we require that you have a confirmed email account. So to help with that, we showed you how you can register an iEmail sender. This is new in .NET 8, the generic iEmail sender of application user. So this means that any properties that you add to your type, you can now access as you're sending people confirmation emails. So if you want to include any extra information you have about that user in your email, that is now possible. So that's exciting. We're using cookies on the server, but what about the WebAssembly rendering? How are we handling that? Does the client have to authenticate separately, doing somewhat like OIDC flow? We decided not to do that. We are doing something simpler. So first, we have the authentication state provider, which we're adding to the DI container in the server project. So this is a lot like the cookie authentication state provider you saw before in the WASM project, but this is running on the server. And it's using persistent component state to take the authentication state from the server and then transfer that to the client via a user info option. So since we choose interactivity auto, sometimes there is a SignalR circuit that can be long running. So if you'd ever run the individual auth with the Blazor server in previous .NET releases, you might have seen this validate security stamp logic. So that means that, if someone, say, changes their password while someone is still connected in, another browser session, this will log you out as it sees the security stamp changes. And by default, it's checking that every 30 minutes. But perhaps the more interesting thing is that we have this on persisting function, which takes the authentication state on the server, which we hook via authentication state changed, and then we persist that as JSON using user info. So to be clear here, we do not take your entire claims principal and serialize this. This is all in your Blazor project from the template. So if you want more information available in the client claims principal via the client authentication state, you will need to add that to this user info, like POCO, that we're serializing as JSON. So this is one half. So this is already exposing the authentication state to the server. Most of the implementation is here in this framework defined revalidating authentication state provider, which then hooks the normal authentication events on the server. So if you have authenticated your app the way you have authenticated a typical Razor Pages or MVC app, you will have that authentication state available to your server-side Blazor component. But then when we take that to your client-side Blazor component, we have another authentication state provider. So one thing to note is that on the server, we do not have any client-side rendering of any of these account components. So since they're accessing what's known as the user manager, so if you were to take a look at like login.razor, for instance, where, injecting the sign-in manager, which is associated with the user manager, and all of these services that are available in Identity are only available on the server. So we render that there. But once we transition from pre-rendering to the client, we also use persistent component state to then read. So you see we have that as a constructor parameter that's dependency injected. So we read that same user info that we wrote on the server, and we configure this authentication state pass that we then make available to things like the authorized view and stuff for rendering. So without further ado, we have an app. We're going to just do a quick register. There are minimum password requirements, like Jeremy told you earlier. It's more or less the same. You'll see that you have to confirm your email account, since that was something that we opted into on the server when we set up at Identity Core. So that's part of the template. If you look at the register confirmation Razor, you'll see that we are rendering a link to configure your account only if you haven't configured a new email sender. So that's what we're going to use right here. We're just going to click that link. That's the same link that would have been emailed, and then we can now log in, and that's exciting. What we can also do is with the, did I mistype my password? I hope yes. And now, yes, I'm logged in as test.example.com on the auth required page, test.example, exciting. If you want to look in the F12 browser tools and we refresh and we look at the console, you'll see that we have transferred to WebAssembly rendering. So there's a pre-rendering step, and then it got re-rendered in WebAssembly, and the same user's still there. That's very exciting. And then, so what if I want to be able to use an external login, right? I already am using Microsoft Entra or whatever. I kind of gave it away earlier when I showed this common.code. I used user secrets to already configure the client ID and the client secret. I'm running this from here, so I'll just restart it after making those changes. And you'll notice that with just adding this call to add Microsoft account on the server project, and then we did also add a NuGet reference, we should, if all goes according to plan, be able to link external login to our account. So we have this Microsoft thing. The same is true. You can log in directly with the Microsoft account, and then it will have you basically create an account while you log in for the first time. So here we have it set up. I did the portal things. I'll use my corporate account, and instead of being test.example.com, hopefully now, I'm still test.example.com, but linked to Microsoft. And if I wanted to have a Microsoft login specifically, that works too. But it sees that I'm associated already. So I think we're running kind of low on time. How much time do we have left? Sorry, I probably should say. All right. Well, that's mostly what I wanted to show. We also support 2FA. I had a little something exciting to show there with setting up. I'm using .NET, or it used to be .NET Interactive. Now it's a polyglot notebook to act as like the fake QR code authenticator app on your phone. But we got that too. So all sorts of features. And so is it time for questions?